Hello everyone, my name is Jeff Rolka. Thank you for checking out my video. This is questions from comments 45. Some really great questions here talking about some historical aspects of singing as well as some forward-thinking aspects of singing and tenor range high notes and mezzos versus sopranos and the bigger conceptual picture of what it is to sing and perform and what that looks like internally, or at least speaking for myself. They've asked a question of me, so I'm going to give you that answer. Thank you if you've chosen to subscribe. If you haven't yet, I hope that you'll do so now. A big thank you to my Patreon supporters, without whom I could not continue to do these things. I really appreciate your support. Thank you very, very much. If you want to get these as MP3s, Patreon's the place to do it. That's where all of these are available from MP3s, as well as the practice sheets that I do with my warm-up videos. Questions from comments 45. Let's get started. I bet your students love discussing technique and music as part of their lessons. Yes, it's quite fun. It really is. And I gotta post it a little bit earlier here, 1 second. I see you as a teacher as opposed to an instructor. I could not ask for higher praise. Thank you very, very much. Sorry to interject again. I do not follow your comments on brilliance in singing. In what I'd call a legitimate voice, old-fashioned terminology I know, I hear different timbres such as high and clear, like a violin or trumpet, and more rich, viola or French horn, but all of them are forward and have what I'd call brilliance, or what I think the Italians call squillo. Can you give some examples of what you were referring to in your comments on less brilliance, not so brilliant, operatic voices, or operatic style? Oh, and I do not think good operatic technique involves belting. All of this is, in my humble opinion, short declarative sentences to state my thinking, not to pick fights or win anything. I'm here to learn, and I do. Oh, I also repeat my endorsement of High Note Bootcamp. Excellent course, and I continue to do some of it almost every day in order to keep the muscle memory and control in shape. I recommend it highly. So from the bottom to the front, thank you for the endorsement of High Note Bootcamp. I don't usually talk about that, and I probably ought to a little bit more. It is my upper register singing course. It is all about making your way across the secondo passaggio. In other words, singing high notes, making that connection between the chest voice and head voice, or thyroarytenoid dominant singing voice, chest voice if you like, and cricothyroid dominant singing voice, head voice if you like. It's on my website, jeffrolka.com, and I'll say no more. I actually think that we agree here in the way that we are hearing the voices, but we're using different terminology. Legit voice, going way back, and I looked for some examples of this on YouTube that I could link to in the description, but I couldn't find any that adequately expressed this particular quality of the voice. So I will demonstrate it to a certain degree here, though it isn't far from what I practice or my expertise. What we would probably describe it as today as an overly covered head voice, or a covered tone quality. And you would notice this mostly as the vocalist was heading into their upper register. So for example, if, and this is middle C, if I were to begin here, where that D is in my zona di passaggio, that is a quality that we would have heard and is sometimes referred to. And I'm thinking of one particular teacher in my past that referred to that quality of voice as legit voice, what we would also call covered. Is it fair to jump to conclusions based on one reference? Not so much. So I have to take responsibility for that. If that is not commonly referred to as legit voice, as an historical representation of the upper register. If the use of the term legit voice isn't used in that way, then that's my fault, and I have perpetuated this usage based upon my own personal history. But this is also what happens a lot in the teaching of singing. One teacher refers to one thing one way, and their student or students will then refer to it moving forward, and it gets perpetuated over time. And this, I'm afraid, also leads to a lot of the confusion in singing terminology. This is why here on the channel, I know it's a bit of a barrier of entry, but when I talk about the upper register of the singing voice, particularly for tenors and baritones, I usually say cricothyroid dominant singing voice instead of head voice. I do that deliberately and specifically because different schools of thought will use the term head voice differently, just the way that they will use the term falsetto differently. And unless we have context, we don't really know how they are using those terms. And so I use cricothyroid dominant singing voice when I talk about tones for tenors and baritones above the secondo passaggio. And there's another example of a term that I chose to use when I started the channel, different from what is typically in usage. Normally the break, or I should say the secondo passaggio, would be referred to as the break. The break is what is commonly that's the common usage of the term that gets commonly thrown around. So I'm sorry that I could not find some examples that I could then play for you. I admit I was a little pressed for time today, and so I could have looked a little bit longer and maybe prepared a little bit better, but hopefully my demonstration will suffice. Suffice to say that squillo and brilliance, I would use those fairly interchangeably. I don't use the term squillo for similar reasons as break and head voice or falsetto, even though that term does typically have a little bit more definition or agreed upon definitions amongst schools of thought. I choose the word brilliance instead. That's, I guess, my preference. I'm a little concerned that squillo, particularly that term, will get used when talking about exercises that are using a lot of vocal fold engagement in order to try to get the students to adduct the vocal fold more firmly. And I wouldn't want to suggest that that level of adduction is always necessary once the individual in question has a balanced, efficient closure of the vocal fold mechanism or adduction of the vocal fold mechanism. At that point, then, the balance in the system will largely work towards creating the kind of brilliance or squillo that's going to be advantageous in performance. I hope that that answers your question, and thank you again for mentioning High Note Bootcamp. Thank you, as always, for being part of the channel. In case of double vowel diphthong when singing lyrics in the classical genre, my teacher tells me to stay on the first vowel, then switch to the second one just before the next syllable. But I sometimes hear opera singers doing strictly the opposite. What is going on? Is this just two different schools? Well, first of all, I would suggest you ask your teacher this. And it's been a couple weeks since this question came in, so hopefully you've already done that. But if you haven't yet, I would encourage you to ask. That is, in my opinion, what your teacher is there for and is there to help you do and help you understand. It is likely that the singers in question to whom you were listening had their reasons for switching to the vowels when they chose to do so. Without specific examples of what you were listening to and being able to listen to myself, I can only speculate. And even if I were to listen to it, since I probably can't talk to the vocalists in question, I wouldn't be able to necessarily answer you directly either. The only way you're likely to get a straight up answer is to talk to the individual vocalist and ask them why they chose to do that there. It is likely that your instructor is asking you to do this Because there's a general rule of thumb when it comes to singing vowel sounds, I mean, sort of in general, but it especially comes up when you have like a melismatic phrase where there's a lot of pitches all in a row that are meant to be sung on a single vowel. But if you have a change in vowel or a change into a consonant at the end, then you want to stay in the vowel as long as you can. So for example, if I were to sing the word from, I don't know why that word just was in my head. From. I'm going to wait until the very end of that phrase to sing the consonant, right? Because the M, though it partially phonates, doesn't really carry the melody quite as nicely. From. I mean, in that instance, we just fully are humming at that point. But what about an R sound? Far. And the R comes in at the very end. Far is generally thought of as being not as pleasant as staying in the vowel sound. So the general rule of thumb is you make the diphthong wait until the very end. Your teacher may have suggested that you do that for that reason, or they may have a different reason. I would suggest highly that you talk to them. And as for the vocalists that you were listening to, I would have to either listen specifically to the examples, but even then I'd only be speculating. But what you might do is listen carefully to the passages that they are singing and ask yourself, what are the vowels that they're working between? Is one particularly closed and is disadvantageous for the range that they are in? Does it then move on to a consonant? And is that going to dampen down the resonance of their voice or close off the phrase prematurely? Any of those could be reasons why they chose to either stay or change the vowel sooner, or they may change it purely for dramatic effect. It really does boil down to listening to the specific examples and seeing if you can determine why that choice might have been made. Kind of a non-answer here, but ultimately, when we practice this in our vocalizations, we are practicing flexibility and control. And that flexibility and control then enables us to make artistic choices in the repertoire the way that the singers that you are referring to chose to do. I do hope that helps. Great question. Why don't you all voice teachers say that the key is using nasal airflow and head voice to do the tenor range? That's a very interesting question. And there is a certain degree of truth to this. Nasal airflow, having the sinus passages open to allow for resonances and allow for that lifted soft palate to buzz and all those soft tissues to release and buzz, that's a part of it for sure. And head voice is part of this too. I refer to it as cricothyroid dominant singing voice. I suspect that, like myself, a lot of other singing instructors do not refer to these things in those terms all the time because they get used differently from different schools of thought. Additionally, there is a lot of history that suggests singing in the tenor range is not comprised of those things. And so it's easier to, from my perspective, talk about the fundamental aspects of tone production above the secondo passaggio for the tenor voice. In other words, talk about high notes above the break for the tenor in new terminology that I can explain in the context of my videos, in the hopes that people will be able to understand it, even if it takes a little bit of practice and maybe even, looking a term up online here and there. And it will ultimately help them to get to do those passages over their secondo passaggio, over their break. They can access that range of their voice, and then they can take advantage of those aspects of their singing voices. When we use terms that have been used to mean a variety of different things, I feel that it breeds confusion. And the last thing that I want to do is cause confusion. So while one might argue, yeah, but Jeff, you use these really awful terms and some of them are in Italian and we have to look them up. Yeah, you might have to look them up, but they're used consistently on my channel. And ultimately, if you were to get fed up with it all and say, this is all too difficult, or this makes sense and they're all contradicting each other, and you went and grabbed a book, then you would read the terms that I'm using. And that, to me, would mean that at least you would have that level of familiarity, and hopefully some light bulbs would go on, and it would then create that access and create that ability so that you can then take advantage of your voice. So I realize that the terms can be confusing. You're not entirely wrong, but also those terms might not mean the same things to the same people because they get used in different ways. And so while it worked for you, or at least I'm assuming it worked for you, I hope it did. I am very glad for that. But it might not work for everyone, or that individual may have a history of using those terms differently, and so consequently, I try to approach it a little differently. I hope that answers your question. Great question. You are amazing, and I love your warm-ups. Thank you, I do appreciate that. Question, how do you know if you are a mezzo or a soprano? First and foremost, you have to work on your vowel alignment in the comfortable range of your voice, and you're going to need to pay attention to where registration events occur. The differences between sopranos and mezzos are kind of subtle, and then maybe there's a little bit more difference when you're at the top end of the range. If we look at the piano here, sopranos will typically have their primo passaggio here, and mezzos here. That's a major second. That's not a terribly, wide range apart, right? They're right next to each other, more or less, just a semitone in between. But without good vowel alignment, that can get obscured. In other words, if you don't have really clear cardinal vowels and you're making a transition into the middle voice area here very effectively, then this transition point is most likely going to be obscured. You won't be able to know exactly where it is. That will mean that you won't really be able to tell mezzo versus soprano. Yes, mezzos will probably have an easier time in this area of their voices. Sopranos will feel more comfortable in this area when they're getting started. On this end of the spectrum, however, we have a bit more change. But the thing is that this may or may not come into play until you're making a smooth transition into the middle voice. Once you've done that, however, E flat will be the secondo passaggio for mezzo-sopranos. So you'll really feel a desire, a sort of physical insistence that the voice switch over into cricothyroid dominant singing voice or head voice beyond that point. Sopranos will be somewhere in this range. It is worth noticing when you are practicing your disposition about how you feel about being in particular areas of your voice. It is also worth mentioning that if you've had some classical training in the past where you have primarily been practicing in your middle voice range, then, and just so we're clear here, middle voice range can span, here to here for the mezzos and then a little bit wider for the sopranos, but still fairly similar, really, in the overall space that we're talking about. If you have primarily been practicing and honing your technique here, then it can make this primo passaggio very, very difficult. If you are having trouble making that transition across the primo passaggio, then you won't be able at that time to define exactly where it is, such that it will help inform whether or not you're mezzo or soprano. But those are the components, those, getting into the middle voice range, the secondo passaggio, the primo passaggio, the overall disposition. Where does it feel best for you to sing? How do you linger? What does it feel like to linger in the middle voice range? What does it feel like around the secondo passaggio? How is passing that point? What does that feel like? How does your voice respond? What's the ease of phonation above or in proximity to the secondo passaggio? And then what is your area below the primo passaggio? What is your disposition there? What does it feel like to then sing in that range? And how does your voice respond? All of those elements, if you will, go into informing what Fach you are. Do you have a sort of mantra or mental focus when you sing? I don't mean paying attention to pitch and rhythm or articulating the sound and meaning of the words. I mean singing technique. For example, from singers I've known, keep it forward, in the mask, lower everything, breathe in back, sing in front, or breath does all, nothing in the throat. They kept these ideas in mind as ways to stay on point with their technique. Do you do something similar? Or just focus on your song and rely on your practice to let the technique come through? I like these surprise short videos, like getting a check in the mail you weren't expecting. There are two things that I think about. One is a Miles Davis quote, which is, "I get my power from my feet." And that, to me, has come to mean rooting into the ground through my heels. So when I'm getting ready to play, I root down through my heels, and I feel myself sinking into the floor that way. And the other one is that I focus on my lateral expansion, my lateral pressing out of the ribs, and so I press out into the ribs. Those are the two predominant thoughts that I cultivate while I'm performing on stage. Rooting down and pressing out. So rooting down and pressing out. Thanks for that. That was fun. Hi Jeff, I appreciate everything you do. Thank you. The only problem I have is I don't have sheet music in front of me. How would I figure out note? This was responding to something I posted about transcription. And in the beginning, if you're figuring out a note, you will probably have to sing it and then hunt and peck on the piano. So if, for example, a random note gets played, and there it is. And if you sang it and then you started hunting and pecking and you lost it, you'd have to sing it again. You might have to rewind, play it and sing it, and then hunt and peck. The important thing here is that this starts to make some connections between physically where your range is on the piano and also where you feel it. This can have an incredibly positive impact on registration event practice and also how you look at the music that you are singing. So if you're looking at a piece of sheet music, or in this case, they say they don't have the sheet music, but they might listen to a piece and there's a really high passage. Like, oh, that sounds like a really high passage. Well, figure out the notes. Again, sing, find it on the piano, and then once you find it on the piano, you may say to yourself, that's really not as high as I thought. That's not going to be as difficult for me as I had feared. And that is, I would posit to you, the biggest benefit to this is it removes the question marks from the equation. It gives you a concrete note or passage to look at. So you can say, this isn't as high as I feared. This is going to be okay. I just need to practice the vowels a little bit. Or, this is a little bit higher than I thought. I will have to practice my registration event technique or my vowel modifications or something else that you determine with your voice in order to be able to sing that effectively. We want to remove the mystery, look at what it is, and then we will be able to adequately understand what challenges we're facing and what we need to do in order to sing the passage effectively. Hi Jeff, I have what is probably a silly question. I am of the opinion that there's no such thing. Obviously, I included it here, so I didn't think it was silly, but thank you for posting that. I appreciate the fact that you posted it, even though you thought it was a bit silly. It's my understanding that appoggio translates to lean, and I frequently hear phrases like lean on the breath. Does this imply actual physical leaning, or is it more of a metaphor? Well, it is kind of both. Appoggio is to lean, and yet it is also a metaphor for us when we're thinking about it. And yet, the concept of leaning is better, in my opinion, than many of the metaphors or similes that get used when talking about breath support for singers. Think about what it means to lean on something. If I were to lean back against the wall, I'm still leaning. Like, my weight is still pressing. It's amazing how much different I sounded. I could hear the reflections. My weight was always pressing into the wall while I leaned back like that. That is a better metaphor, a better analogy, in my opinion, for what appoggio is. You've heard me, you maybe, use words like persistent airflow, consistent. I'm sure I've used other words like that. Insistent is another one that I quite like as well, particularly in the upper register. All of those words have an aspect of in perpetuity to them. In other words, it keeps on going. And yet, what frequently gets overlooked when we talk about belly breathing, and especially for that push out, suck in, push out, suck in, is that there is a really large amount of disengagement that happens in the breath cycle. In other words, when there is no activity, when it is disengaged from the process of creating subglottic air pressure, engagement, support, if you like. When we practice appoggio, in my mind, if I were to take that idea of to lean, I am leaning laterally out, and I keep leaning in that direction all the while I am lifting and engaging towards my sternum to create subglottic air pressure to use to sing. And that lean doesn't stop at any point in the cycle. It is in perpetuity. So to lean, I think, is both literal and metaphorical. And while I realize that that may create a little bit of confusion, if it does, I hope that you'll leave another comment so that we can talk about it some more, because I'm very, very passionate about, I suppose it's now really two things here on the channel. It began with upper register development and demystifying the secondo passaggio, demystifying the break. It has come to also include appoggio breath management over the years. And the more that I think we can embrace it and learn the intricacies of the technique, the better we will be able to use our voices in a sustainable way and gain that much more enjoyment from them. And on a personal note, appoggio just changed everything for me for the better. So please leave a comment if we need any clarification. And as for anything else that we've talked about today, you can leave a comment regarding that as well. Thank you as always. I love the questions. I love these segments. Thank you again to my Patreon supporters. I truly appreciate your support. Thank you all. If you've chosen to subscribe, if you haven't yet, I hope that you'll do so now. And until next time, I will say thank you so very much for watching. Take really good care of your voices, enjoy singing, and hopefully we'll see you again. Bye.